I'm going to say a few words about the history of US-Romanian relations as an introduction to the transmission that you are going to make on this subject. According to its practice in European matters, the US government waited until France, Britain and Germany recognized Romania's independence on the 20th of February 1880. It was only then that the US opened a legation in Bucharest, and it appointed a gentleman called Eugene Schuyler, who was a jurist, as consul general to Russia and Turkey, and he was also chosen to head the representation in Bucharest. And in fact, in January 1881, he was granted the title of Chargé d'Affaires by Washington. But both the US and Romania viewed their bilateral relationship with relative indifference, we might say. And in less than 2 years, Schuyler's residence in Bucharest was transferred to Athens, in keeping with his duties as minister plenipotentiary to Greece and Serbia, as well as Romania. It was only in 1905 that Bucharest became the residence of a US minister accredited to Romania. On the Romanian side, there seems to have been little interest in opening a legation in the US. As late as 1913, Secretary of State William Jennings noted that Romania was, I quote, the only country in the world that has no political or commercial representation in the United States, end of quote. The US, however, entry into World War I on the 6th of April 1917 brought the two countries closer together. Writing of this event in his memoirs, Ion Duca, the Prime Minister of Romania, from the 14th of November to the 29th of December 1933, looking back, exclaimed, "Our joy was indescribable. At that moment when the United States entered the war, we knew the war was won." End of his words. The first Romanian minister to the US, Constantin Anghelescu, presented his letters of accreditation at the White House on the 15th of January 1918. After the First World War, the US reverted to its policy of isolation in international affairs, and it never became, for example, a member of the League of Nations, the League which, in fact, President Woodrow Wilson, had advocated be founded after World War I. In the view of many historians, this US absence reduced the League of Nations' effectiveness. It is no accident that the US remained neutral until the declaration of war on Japan following the attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. Germany declared war on the US on the 11th of December, and in response, the US Congress declared war on Germany a few hours later. Romania declared war on the US on the 12th of December 1941, but it was only on the 5th of June 1942 that the United States declared war on Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Upon the conclusion of World War II, Britain and the US were faced with the Soviet Union in military occupation of much of Central and Eastern Europe, including, of course, Romania. Their thoughts turned to damage limitation, but without an effective lever of sanction, apart from the military option, which no senior politician in the wake of a long war was prepared to countenance, they were reduced to the role of spectators in the Soviet colonization of Central and Eastern Europe. Romania's leader, Gheorghiu Dej, embarked upon a policy of autonomy from the Soviet Union after 1956. In 1958, he persuaded the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev to withdraw the 35,000 Soviet troops from Romania. He also rejected the Soviet plan to encourage Romania to become a breadbasket for the Soviet-driven trade bloc called Comecon, and focused instead on the development of Romanian industry. The country reached out to the West to consolidate its commercial and cultural relations. Nicolae Ceausescu, on succeeding Gheorghiu, continued to place what he regarded as Romania's interest above that of the Kremlin. Unlike other members of the Warsaw Pact, that is the Soviet military alliance, Romania did not break diplomatic ties with Israel after the Six-Day War in June 1967. Growing recognition of Romania's political usefulness as a thorn in the flesh of the Soviet Union prompted a period of increasing Western courtship of Ceausescu, exemplified by President Nixon's visit in August 1969. Nixon's decision to go to Bucharest and meet Ceausescu provided a textbook example of Nixon's policy of differentiation. Not only did it mark a turning point in Washington's relations with Bucharest, but it also showed to other members of the socialist bloc that the United States was willing to be a partner. The Romanian leader returned the visit in October 1970, when at Nixon's invitation, Ceausescu made the first state visit of a Romanian president to the United States. There followed a succession of economic favors. In 1971, Romania was admitted to the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, so-called GATT, and in 1972, it was accepted into the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Throughout the 1970s, Romania expanded its foreign trade relations with the West to a greater degree than any other country in the East Central European bloc. The country's trading position was enhanced when the country acquired preferential trading status with the European Community, that's the forerunner of the European Union, in 1973. The US Congress, in passing the Trade Act of 1974, permitted the president to extend most favored nation status to communist countries. Section 402 of this act, known as the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, prohibited the extension of most favored nation status to any country that denied its citizens the right to emigrate, but also allowed the president of the US to waive this provision if he found that such a waiver would substantially promote the objectives of freedom of emigration. And it was in recognition of Ceausescu's success in tweaking the nose of the Russians that at the end of July 1975, President Ford granted Romania most favored nation tariff status. With its award, the US Congress was able to hold Ceausescu's feet to the fire over human rights issues in Romania, most notably the right or opportunity to emigrate. Quite apart from its considerable trade benefits to Romania, for example, Romanian exports to the US almost doubled from $133 to $233 million between 75 and 77. So apart from these benefits, which the award of MFN brought, of even greater value was to Ceausescu was the certificate of respectability that it implied not only for his emigration policies, but also for his treatment of wider human rights issues in Romania. Ceausescu visited the US again in April 78 for a third state visit at the invitation of President Jimmy Carter. He thus set an unprecedented record of such visits for the head of a state of a Warsaw Pact country. 2 months later, he was given an honor unprecedented to the head of a Warsaw Pact country, namely a state visit to the United Kingdom. 1978, we can say, marked the apogee of Ceausescu's acceptability in the West. It was only after Ceausescu's relevance on the world stage was undermined by the accession to power of Mikhail Gorbachev in March 1985 that Western support for Ceausescu faded. With the advent of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union, Ceausescu's usefulness as a bridge between East and West rapidly evaporated for a number of the very positions which the Romanian leader had adopted in his foreign policy, and which had gilded his autonomous image in the West, now became features of Soviet policy. I can mention here the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan, the removal of short-range nuclear weapons from Europe, and reductions in nuclear arsenals. Once Ceausescu's failure to adopt Perestroika and glasnost had begun to draw criticism from the Soviet leadership, some Western ambassadors, though by no means all, were instructed to make a point of inviting Romanian dissidents to official receptions in Bucharest. In July 1988, Ceausescu renounced the most favored nation trade concessions in the face of White House and congressional demands for improved human rights performance. And from that date, Ceausescu's notoriety, we might say, in the US descended rapidly. And ultimately, we have, of course, the revolution of December 1989 and the execution of Ceausescu on Christmas Day 1989, and the beginning, with the collapse of communism, of a new era in US-Romanian relations.